Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. You're so beautiful. Thank you to Alyssa Paris and everyone at Midwest Mixed. That's such an obnoxiously long bio. I'm sorry, never again. Okay. So I'm a transracial Korean adoptee, and I'm not mixed in the way that we think about racially mixed. I do have two mixed children who are elderly now. They are 22 and 18. So they're not like cute and adorable, and you don't want to see their pictures, and they smoke a lot of marijuana, and my job is done. It's like, oh, just carry on, children. I love them. They're okay. So I'm not going to talk about my parenting or mothering. That's, I feel like that's their story too. Of course, I try to get them to come to things like this, and they're just like, Mom, no. They'll come around. Just wait. Okay. So as a transracial Korean adoptee who's not mixed, I'm actually very, very touched to be included in this community and in this gathering, which I know has its distinctive intersections. So thank you for the time. Many transracial adoptees are mixed. I won't speak for them. And like me, many have mixed children. All of us are in mixed race families if we've been transracially adopted. And we know that race is a social and legal construct for the benefit of white supremacy, but nevertheless has very real dimensions in this racialized white supremacist society. Love saying white supremacy in churches. Just say it again, white supremacy. Okay, so last month I made my 5th trip back to the Korean Peninsula where I was born, and that's part of my ongoing attempt to understand my story and the US-Korea relationship. So I finally took my own kids back there. They hadn't ever been. And I thought that it was going to be, I was hoping like this would be this amazing ancestral trip, and hi, Abby, and it would be really epic, and it kind of was, we did a lot of great things, but also at the end I asked them, so like, did you get the ancestral like feelings, like all of that, and what was the most memorable thing about the trip? What will you take away with you? And both of them were like, oh, it was just really a great trip to be just the 3 of us together. And I was like, so I could have just taken you to the Wisconsin Dells. Like, I spent thousands of dollars and, Okay, so they're going to come around. But that's part of my reality as the mother of mixed children. So I was adopted from South Korea. I became a naturalized US citizen because this was before the Adoptee Citizenship Act of 2000. So I was a legal resident alien from the age of 1 and 1 month until about 5. I was raised by I have to look at my notes, like who are these people? I was raised by white, in parentheses, Irish, German, and Polish Roman Catholic family in a southwestern working class suburb of Chicago called Brookfield, Illinois. And really thinking about this theme of disrupting the single story was really exciting to me because I hadn't framed it in this way in any really recent chats that I've been able to participate in. So I was born in what's officially the ROK, Republic of Korea. North Korea is officially the DPRK, Democratic Republic of Korea. So the word democracy just doesn't mean anything. And it was 21 years after the armistice of the still ongoing Korean Civil War, and I was born into a harsh military dictatorship into a society under Park Chung-hee. He had seized power in a military coup in '61, and he had declared himself president for life in 1972. So when I hear, the US president talk about, well, I might not certify any results if I don't win, just authoritarianism does not even have to be very smart. right? It's a set of behaviors. Fascism is a set of behaviors. It just repeats itself. It's just like, what is the worst thing I can do? That's fascism, right? In every situation. So disrupting the single story. So many of us Korean adoptees, particularly of a certain era in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, were told by our parents or parent, who were told by our adoption agencies or social welfare agencies, this line. I really got like 2 sentences about my entire history and my entire reason for becoming an American, which was, if you had stayed in Korea, you would have been a prostitute or dead. Your mother was poor and wanted a better life for you. So that was really my internal refrain of like my life options and everything that there was to know and to say about my history into this mixed race experience. But what America has told me, and many of us, over and over again, is that I should be grateful to be an American, because America is the best country that's ever existed, that exists and will ever exist. And therefore, every violence it has committed is a virtue and is justified under a Christian Protestant God. So my talk is really about the purity of the fundamentalism of purity, and how in my life and in my history, and having to discover my history of how I got here, how I got to be, a body in this place, is all wrapped up in Christian Protestantism, in the US Cold War, Orientalism, and all these other things that have taken me a long time and taken us collectively as an adoptee community and community of Asian Americanists and Koreanists and feminist scholars and gender scholars to tease out from the official histories of US involvement in Korea, what a family is, how we create kinships, what that means, who's valuable and who's not valuable. So, I as a person of color should be grateful that white Americans tolerate my presence, and that the presence of people of color is really a pollution into the white body politic, and that all people of color and women of color especially are disposable. And that if we cannot, the neoliberal immigrant rhetoric too is that if we cannot contribute to the endless, eternal, and virtuous economic growth of this racial capitalism, all the while not being seen or heard, right? We should go back, to where we crawled out from. So for me, the purity, racial purity, is a fundamentalism. And for those of us who are Korean adoptees, and really, all of us, inextricable from nationalism and patriarchy. This is a really cheerful talk, like, yay, 10:30 in the morning. So 2 definitions of purity, if you just search it up. Freedom from adulteration or contamination, and freedom from immorality, especially of a sexual nature. So the other thing that's a part of, a lot of our stories, I think, is also the cult of white womanhood as mothers who are superior to black and brown mothers everywhere, and that reproductive justice as defined by white feminism is really about white women having choices, or has been about white women having choices. About white women having choices. And white supremacy for you over there, in case you didn't, okay. So I'm not indigenous to Minnesota Makoche or to Turtle Island, but I'm indigenous to the Korean Peninsula as a former unified kingdom, and before that multiple kingdoms, a continuous civilization with its own language for over 5,000 years. And even just that sense of time and going back to a homeland that has that sense of history really helps me understand the difference between different types of collectivism and US individualism, and the US being such a young nation. So my people and my land were colonized and annexed by the Empire of Japan, officially in 1910, although of course it started earlier. Japan's official colonization of Korea ended when Japan surrendered to the Allies at the end of World War II. And so, like a lot of other nations newly independent, there was a struggle for political power, which led to this Korean Civil War, which led to the US getting involved militarily to fulfill its communist containment policy, and really became the first war of the Cold War. So it's getting up to, we're moving into, how all of these Korean children became US, not even citizens, because there's a number of us who were not, whose adoptive parents didn't facilitate our citizenship. And so some of us have been deported when we encounter the criminal justice system. So during World War II, this is also part of the patriarchy and the sexual purity aspect of my story and the story of others in the Korean adoption diaspora. So Japan, you probably know, kidnapped and coerced hundreds of thousands of Korean and other Southeast Asian, but mostly Korean girls and women as young as 12, maybe younger, to serve as sexual slaves to the Japanese army. And the comfort women are still fighting. There's just a handful of them left in their 90s, are still fighting for reparations and for official full apology from the Japanese state. And the state used the euphemism comfort women. So this militarism and sexualization of Korean women is really part of the purity heritage that has resulted in me and other people being here. So the US got involved because of communism, and the war and the US devastated the peninsula and created devastation and poverty and millions of refugees during the course of, and created the North Korea that we have today, that we're contending with today, the isolationist North Korea and closed off North Korea. So that's another notion of boundaries and purity that's affecting our geopolitics and, my own personal story. And, the US dropped more ordnance on North Korea than that was dropped in all of World War II. Every single town and village was destroyed, and committed war crimes against South Koreans and against refugees. So the US occupied the Korean Peninsula during the Civil War and occupied over 80 military bases that the Japanese had installed in this country the size of Indiana, right? Where there's about 70 million people living there on the whole peninsula right now. And where there are American soldiers, there is sex work. The US government and the Korean government colluded and coordinated, and there's records, and there's been a lot of great research done on it, this military sexual intimacy, and to make these Yankee towns functional and to serve these American men. And so my government, this is in 1950 to 1953, 20 years before I was born. So my government basically sold, girls and women to American men. And then where you have sex work, you have children. So the first children who were Korean adoptees, my kind of social position forebears, were mixed race children of American GIs of various races, not just white, and Korean women. And because of the ideology of racial purity in Korea, which really conflates the nation and race in a way that the US tries to do, but also tries to have this multicultural virtue, those children were not absorbable into the body politic. And not only were they polluted by being mixed race, in the eyes of much of the society, they were, issues from polluted bodies, Korean girls and women who were conscripted into providing the service and who were, then shamed. Many were not accepted back into their families. There were suicides. There was isolation for all those women, for most of those women, because of patriarchy. So I also, this is not just about critiquing South Korean government or the US government, because really there's almost nowhere on the planet, aside from, I would think, like some traditional societies, where girls and women are free from sexual exploitation, assault, violence, and death at the hands of men and their families. So, as a woman, I feel that no government on earth really holds my interests as equal to men, or equal to or above wealth generation. Okay, so back to purity. These mixed-race children of the Korean women and the US military personnel, right, they weren't accepted because of this ideology, the ideology that is called Danil Minjok, or one people. It's existed since ancient times, similar to Mongolian or Han race systems. And in the 1960s, 10 years before I was born, President Park Chung-hee, the military dictator who later was assassinated, strengthened this ideology of racial purity to legitimate his authoritarian rule. So you can see how, leaders, of course, weaponize these ideas of purity to solidify their support, to create scapegoats. We've seen it over and over, to dehumanize and create enemies, whether from within or without, both. North Korea's official propaganda has portrayed Koreans as the cleanest race, and it serves its ideology too, as well as its ideology of juche, of self-reliance, and of it officially doesn't need any other assistance from other nations. So this shared conception of a racially defined Korea continues to shape Korean politics and foreign relations. And it gives Koreans an impetus to national pride, and it also feeds into hopes for reunification of the two Koreas into one Korea. And the first time I went back to Korea as an adoptee in 1987, it was a year before the Korean Olympics in 1988, and I was really struck by how, when we were met by ministers and officials, they all said things like, you're coming back to us, you're Korean first and foremost, and you need to take your Western education and come back and serve, your people. I hadn't ever really experienced that kind of racial nationalism in that particular way. So South Korea is one of the more ethnically homogenous nations, partially because of its physical isolation as a peninsula, and partially because of its ideologies. There's only 3.4% foreigners living in South Korea right now, many of whom are migrant workers or women who've married Korean men and who generally have second-class status. Because the mixed-race children, many of them ended up really being stateless, because it wasn't until 1998 that you could become a Korean citizen if you were born to a Korean woman. So that's another way that the patrilineal purity operated. Those children whose fathers were American citizens, U.S. citizens, they under U.S. law were U.S. citizens, and under Korean law, could not be Korean citizens because their mothers were Korean, but their fathers weren't Korean. And that didn't change until, the end of the 20th century. So many of those mixed race children were orphaned, not because their parents were dead, but because of an inability for the society to support them or their mothers. And at the ceasefire in 1953, here comes more Christianity. American Christian missionary Harry Holt and his family, farmer from Oregon, came on a humanitarian trip to South Korea, saw that there were these children living in orphanages or on the street, and started this whole Korean industry Korean adoption industry that still exists today and that many other transnational or intercountry adoption systems have been modeled on. Like the Korean system was considered the gold standard and was supposed to be free of corruption, free of kidnapping, free of child trafficking, free of child laundering, all these other things that that we continue to see in transnational adoption because of the market forces that where white middle-class families mostly demand this option for building their family. And the reason that it's been more popular, one of the reasons it's been more popular than domestic adoption, and parents, prospective parents have said this, and they've said that, we don't want this child's mother coming to the doorstep asking for their child back. So the further the distance, both culturally, linguistically, economically, geographically, has been a part of that whole calculus that's brought, children of color into these white families, often just very isolated. The adoptions have reduced to a trickle, but, it's such a lifelong condition that is constantly changing, which adoption industry and prospective parents really don't understand. They think, well, I'm gonna get my child, they're gonna assimilate into my family, and then like happily ever after. But those of us know that with every new milestone, with every new life shift, the meaning of being a person of color, the meaning of being adopted, the meaning of being an immigrant is always changing and is always very vulnerable to the political tides of how we as bodies in the nation are employed for whatever political purposes, cultural purposes, the dominant culture is looking for. So, as American dollars began flowing into the adoption system, of course there was corruption. And, it's really interesting that we're seeing now with DNA and registries, all of these different, what are called non-parental events, where over 250,000 people last year through commercial DNA tests discovered who they thought was their father wasn't really their father, and all of, and then the donor-conceived children are coming of age and are asking their own questions as well. And so all of these different ways that Americans have created families and where people have been promised anonymity, whether it was, my birth mother or whether it was, a college-aged donor, sort of like all these reproductive chickens are coming home to roost. And we're gonna be reckoning, with the ways that families have been created and are continuing to be created, and what are the ethics of those reproductive choices and rights. So I would say that, my adoptee forebears were ethnically cleansed from the body politic of South Korea as reproductive surplus, as products from the bodies of women who allowed themselves to be defiled by foreigners, by the occupying force, by the occupying military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we were sent to these nations that are organized around white supremacy, European superiority, when we were told, we've been told, and we continue to be told in the dominant narrative, although we're making inroads very slowly, that we've hit the life wheel of fortune by landing in the United States. So it's a lot to untangle in a child's life, and often, they're alone and don't have any language for this. So transracial adoption, or specifically transnational adoption, which often has been transracial adoption, many others see it as a colonial practice, as an extension of colonial practices, one that values white women's mothering and white families and middle-class white values over families of color and families from the global South. It's been an industry that's too often served the desires of the white family and the white state to think of itself as a global humanitarian. Like, oh, well, the US went to Korea, tried to fight communism, didn't win. It was kind of a stalemate, massacred many innocent civilians. The country was like 90% peasants before the Civil War, and dropped all this ordnance on North Korea and created this kind of Gorgon state that we have today. Although a great resource is a book by scholar Arissa Oh at Boston College. The book is To Save the Children of Korea, The Cold War Origins of International Adoption, from Stanford University Press. And she calls this expression of nationalism that works in all these different ways to justify the extraction of children of citizens from other nations. She calls it American Christianism. And her current project examines the history of marriage migration and immigration fraud since the 19th century. Her research and teaching interests include immigration, race, gender, and family in the US history and transnational Asian American history. So what adoption advocates have done in the US is create this birth fiction since 2000, where any child born in another country who's a citizen of that country, if there's birthright citizenship, then can become a US citizen without the friction of like being an illegal alien or being a legal resident alien that I went through, by, as if pretending that their American US citizen parents are actually their birth parents. You get a birth certificate, right? Which has, like, I have a record of a foreign birth certificate, and then I have a birth certificate. But since 2000, that's been erased. So it's just like greasing the wheels of the absorption of mostly brown bodies into the US body politic, because those families want to have fewer obstacles to gaining these children. And all often under the rhetoric of, like, this sentimental, you're the same as my other children, or you are my child. All these, like, just the possessiveness of the bourgeois family. I felt like I had like 5 hours of speech. And I know you're sad that it's not going to go on for 5 hours. Usually I have so much. It's like, okay, and then my manifesto on purity. But also, like, it's a lot of information. And, but I really, any chance I get, especially with, I feel like, who are, folks who are my people, or you don't have to claim me, but like adjacent, that I really want to advocate for all the children who are still being adopted into these white families who, they haven't really, I work with them, they haven't progressed that much, if progress is the word, in terms of understanding how this impacts, really the psyche and the well-being of each individual child, as well as how it operates politically. So for me, racism or whiteness, which was invented, we know, by the Euro-American owning class in the Americas to first keep African indentured servants from doing labor organizing for better conditions with Irish and European poor indentured servants, and created racialized chattel slavery that was a permanent, inheritable condition, inheritable through the mother, right? The mother's body, this ultimate reproductive injustice of stealing not just a people's future, but a specific woman's future, that not only was she a slave for life, her children would be slaves, her grandchildren would be slaves, even if their father was the master, right? So how dissociated and sick does a society have to be to enslave their own children? So in terms of whiteness, truth and reckoning, and trying to understand how whiteness operates, white people have a long way to go. So for me, purity is trauma. And purity is family separation. Purity makes everyone vulnerable to those who decide what purity is and the value of it to the state or to the individual. Purity is an ideological condition for exile and genocide. So those of us who have to fight for access to our own histories, because we may have multiple threads colluding with the propaganda of who we are and who our ancestors were, and under what conditions they lived. And those of us who want to claim and understand all of our complexities and our interdependence with all life on Earth, not even our common humanity, but just our common, what should be our common allegiance to life. We're resisting fundamentalism, which is usually defined, it's dictionarily defined as a religion, but I see that purity is like a religion and gets deployed, especially by the US government, as religion and as money. So it's like the money is part of the religion, right? In God we trust, which didn't get put on the money until the 50s. So we're resisting fundamentalism, the fundamentalism that creates all kinds of borders, whether internal or physical, spiritual, political. And those borders are violence. They are inherently violent. And I want to add as a side note that borders are not the same as boundaries, and it's not the same as sovereignty. So I really, really appreciate all of you being here, building community like this, all the Midwest Mixed folks who make these spaces possible. It's a ton of work, as we all know. Please connect with me if you want to work on any of these issues. I saw in my bio, I was like community cultural worker. I was like, I'm so tired. What about like cultural napper? Like, do we have to work so much? Like, maybe we just don't have to. I'm trying to like take the word work out of all my bios. Like, now I am your elder, young people. Let me pass the torch of righteousness on to those of you under the age of 45. And I'll just sit back and enjoy. So please connect with me if you want to work or nap on any of those issues, or want to learn more about transracial adoption and our intersections. And I just want to say I'm really grateful for all of you and for this space. And thank you very much.